that. The people who come in to see you and say, oh, don't put me on those, I don't want to get addicted. Even if I'm dying, I don't want to die an addict, right? Or who believes less is more, even though the medicine says it's something else. It even is in some of you who practice your medicine and believe in those same things, that less is more, or whatever it might be, right? I mean, so we know that that's part of what goes on there, that broader societal attitude about that these opioid medications cannot be used effectively in the vast majority of people. And that it's understanding, for example, the failure in our society to distinguish between dependence and addiction. I mean, to my mind, my definition of addiction is addiction equals dependence plus problems. So, you can be dependent on a drug without being addicted. You can be dependent on methadone, as a former heroin addict, and maybe take it for the rest of your life, and that is the proper medical course. You may be dependent on a pain medication for a long period of time, but you are not addicted to it. You may be a diabetic taking your insulin for the rest of your life, but you are not an insulin addict. You may be taking a hard drug for your heart, but you are not an addict. You are only dependent. And that is a medical definition that can be managed, on which there are no moral connotations. There should be none because of the nature of the substance to which you're dependent upon. The notion that because you're dependent on insulin, we would never call you an addict, but if you're dependent on methadone, we call you an addict, that's not science. That's prejudice. Let's just be straight out about that. There's nothing about the name of a substance or the identity of a substance that distinguishes dependence from addiction. Now, how does dependence, and you can have a problem with drugs, of course, and not be addicted. You can be the person who uses drugs only occasionally, but when you do, you can't control it. You do stupid stuff. You get drunk and you drive and you get violent, whatever, even though you're not addicted in the sense of always doing it repeatedly. But when dependence becomes addiction, it happens in two ways. One is that the dependence on the drug has consequences for your body. You drink too much booze, there goes your liver. Right? You smoke too many cigarettes, there go your lungs and other parts. Right? If you use cocaine too repeatedly, damage to your heart. Right? We know these things. Right? You become dependent upon opiates. Well, now explain to me. If you're dependent upon an opiate and you're taking it for the rest of your life, what exactly are the health consequences of that? I mean, you're not going to do your liver, it's not going to do your brain, your lungs, whatever. In fact, what we know is that you can be dependent upon an opioid medication for, in fact, 30, 40, 50, or 60 years. And the principal side effect for many people is going to be constipation. Yeah. And maybe a little reduced sensitivity to emotional and physical pain that you have to pay special attention to. But it's not like the other thing. So what is a heroin addict exactly? It's a person who is dependent upon an opioid medication, otherwise known as diamorphine. Change the name of heroin to diamorphine, and people chill. Right? Quite frankly, in this Vancouver heroin maintenance study, you know what they found in that study? They gave experienced heroin addicts in a controlled double-blind test. Some of them got Dilaudid instead of heroin. And you want to know something? Experienced heroin users who could tell the difference between heroin and morphine, heroin and methadone, heroin, a whole bunch of other drugs administered the same way, they could not tell the difference between pharmaceutical heroin and pharmaceutical Dilaudid. Essentially saying that Dilaudid is heroin and vice versa, quite frankly. But people don't freak out when you say Dilaudid. It's one of the medications you guys prescribe. But in fact, among an experienced street-using population, they couldn't tell the difference. Right? So dependence becomes addiction, either because the drug is damaging to you, as with alcohol, cocaine, cigarettes, right? Not necessarily nicotine, right? I mean, you can be on nicotine maintenance. They can slap that patch on, you know, oh yeah, that's supposed to help you get off cigarettes, and 5 years the patch is still there, right? You're still whacking away at your chewing gum, for 12 years, right? But the fact of the matter is you can be chewing that damn gum or keeping that patch on for the rest of your life, and the principal risk is a slightly elevated cardiovascular risk when you get older. But by and large, nicotine in that form, while it's highly dependence-causing, right, and why is the hook, the trap in cigarettes, is not destroying you, it's the way you consume it, right? It's the particle matter, what have you. What transforms dependence and addiction then is either because the drug itself can be damaging to the body, which is not so much the case in the opioids, or because our public laws and policies are transforming the dependence into an addiction. You may be dependent on an opioid medication, but if all of a sudden that opioid medication can only be obtained from the street, now it costs 5 to 10 times what it would otherwise cost. when you don't know the potency or purity of what you're getting because it comes from the black market and nothing resembling an underground Food and Drug Administration has emerged to regulate the quality of drugs on the streets, right? That's when that dependence becomes an addiction. When you are injecting drugs that you're doing in back alleys and other places because nobody can see you do it because otherwise you'll get arrested, that's when it becomes an addiction. When you are being thrown into jails and prisons and forced to detox in a brutal way and get back on, that's when it becomes an addiction. It's the ways in which our laws and policies transform a dependence upon a drug into something horrific. And it's when we add in the imagery and the stigma. Oh, you are dependent, you are addicted, and we transform people's own self-identity. In a way, the addict becomes the person we are telling them they are. Right? When you take a group of people and you treat them as crap, when you treat them without respect, when you treat them as demonized, right? When you treat them as second and third class, when black people in this country were primarily treated as slaves, it wasn't just white people who perceived them as slaves, but it was oftentimes black people, black slaves, who perceived themselves as slaves. When gay people are perceived as deviant by the broader world, then they can see themselves that. When women are perceived as second and third class citizens and inferior, as they were for so many millennia, women on some level, even when they fight for their own equality, there's that way in which they can believe and somehow accept, because they've grown up and lived in a society accepting somehow their own innate inferiority. When you're talking about a group of people who are using these drugs, whether they're under your administration or obtained from the streets, that sort of societal imagery affects everything, their perception and your perception. And the fact of the matter is that even when you're engaged in pain medication, you can't remove yourself from the broader imagery, from the meth ads out there and from the TV things and the Partnership for Great America and all of the drug war hysteria and what have you. But it is your obligation to do the best possible job you can on that. It really is.